Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 43. A few quick bits of channel admin. First of all, I forgot to mention in the previous Drydock that the deadline for competition entries should have been that Sunday. So yeah, I guess I'll accept entries up for this week. So yes, midnight on Sunday the 26th will be the last acceptable deadline for competition entries. As a result of that, obviously I'm going to have to push back the announcement of winners and the announcement of the new competition by a week as well, because oh my goodness did a load of you respond. So yes, I am quietly sifting through all the entries and organising them and evaluating them, so that'll be fun. I've got something to do this bank holiday weekend at least. Anyway, outside of that, as you may or may not have noticed, some ads appearing on the videos as per the last Drydock. If you have any comments or suggestions on that, let me know. And with that, let's get on to the questions for this week. So the two videos we're taking particular questions from for the first part of this are the video about the raid on the Medway and the guide to USS Florida. Well, the Florida class battleships. Anyway, so let's take a look first at the Medway video. So the sources used in creating this particular video are the Anglo-Dutch Naval Wars, 1652 to 1674, always good for a read. A little bit of background detail from the 4 Days Battle of 1666, and also, if you'll excuse me, sorry, for a second, the ship of the line, picture obviously above there, hopefully, and the command of the ocean, a naval history of Britain. All pictures above that. So, with that said, what questions did some of you have from that video? George Pott asks, were there any significant changes to British or Dutch tactics, doctrine or ship design as a result of the Battle of the Medway? Well, as it was more raid than battle, not so much in the realms of ship tactics for battle. What it did, however, emphasise was a number of things. One, the efficacy of marine forces, i.e. the Dutch Marines and such like, which served to re-emphasise the need for the Royal Marines. Then you also had, obviously, the weakness of the British fortifications, which is what allowed the Dutch to get into the Medway in the first place. So the British and, well, the Dutch already had this, but the British definitely began to move the concentrations of Royal Navy ships away from relatively lightly defended, fairly open anchorages to much more heavily defended locations, and if an anchorage was really good but lightly defended, the fortifications there were stepped up quite significantly. Juan Carosio asks, when Royal Navy ships were decommissioned, say 1900 to the 1940s, was the metal recycled for other Royal Navy uses, or was the steel sold for general scrap? Generally, since most of the steel had been through the wear, tear and degradation associated with being at sea for extended periods of time, it wasn't really in much of a condition to be worth using in brand new ships. There's also the fact that a lot of the beams and the ribbing, keel, framework of the ships, plating, etc., had obviously been designed and shaped for a particular type of ship, and so you couldn't really just stick it in on another kind of ship because it would be completely the wrong shape and size. So no, recovered steel, scrap steel, was sometimes melted down and used in new ships, but the Royal Navy would buy new steel for the construction of its ships in most cases. So if a bit of steel, structural steel, ended up in a new Royal Navy warship, it would be pure luck that the people scrapping an old ship had sold that steel to a mill that was incorporating it into the steel that they were making for a new ship. However, other bits of the ships were recycled. The Royal Navy tended to like holding on to spare armour plate wherever it could, because the processes involved in producing high-grade battleship and cruiser armour plate are actually quite expensive, and for the most part armour plates tend to be fairly flat, so you can actually reuse them on other ships. So for example, when the Renown and Repulse needed upgrades, they were of armour plate. They would get some of the armour from the former Chilean battleship Almirante Cochrane was used, because the Royal Navy had that lying around, and obviously they kept other of the more expensive and complex bits like guns and turrets lying around, hence HMS Vanguard. Lukman Hakim asks, what would happen if the Dutch burned and damaged Chatham Harbour? At the time, this would have been a very bad thing. The damage would have been pretty extensive because, as with all wooden warships at the time, there's an awful lot of combustible material that goes into them, so you would have had seasoning wood, which is very difficult to find and replace, and takes a long time to replace as well. Stores of rope, stores of tar, stores of pitch, stores of canvas. All those wonderful flammable things. If that lot goes up, there's an awful lot of damage that can be caused. I mean, if for a more recent example, if you look at some of the engravings and other pictures that were made of what Norfolk, Virginia looked like after it was torched, there's an awful lot of destruction involved there. And that's with a bunch of buildings made of brick and stone, whereas back in the Medway period we're talking about, a lot of them would have been largely wooden. So if they'd burned and damaged it, it would have been a very serious blow to the Royal Navy, probably more serious than the ships they actually lost, because even a wooden warship can be replaced in a few years. A dockyard, as kind of we were covering when I spoke with military history visualised in our chat about coastal fortifications, you can't replace a harbour and its infrastructure very quickly at all, plus all the stores. So the stores alone might have represented the fitting out or refitting capacity of the country for several dozen major warships, which now either couldn't be completed or couldn't be repaired and refitted, and the loss of all the other bits and pieces would have meant that the Royal Navy's ability to replace losses and to build new large ships would have been compromised for years, possibly decades to come. So that could have seriously impaired the Royal Navy at the time. John Benson asks, out of curiosity, is the line "To honour we call you as freemen, not slaves" from Heart of Oak meant to be tongue-in-cheek? It always struck me as a little odd, considering the Royal Navy's liberal use of impressment to crew her ships. Well, the interesting thing is the original line there actually said, "To honour we call you, not press you like slaves." And then it was modified later on to what you quoted, which is obviously now what is sung generally. So they were aware of impressment. However, it's two parts really. One is that whilst people generally tend to make a big deal about Royal Navy impressment, the Royal Navy used impressment as a tactic of last resort, because ultimately you generally weren't going to get that good quality sailors out of impressment, and the Royal Navy didn't really want that. They only used it when they absolutely could not get the crews to crew their ships at all. So it only tended to show up during the sort of the worst periods of the Napoleonic Wars and other similar things like that. And to be honest, it was very popular on land for obvious reasons, but not particularly popular in the Navy either. Whereas in other European nations, basically grabbing people and slinging them into the Navy was kind of par for the course. It was a lot more common. Not all navies, obviously, there were all volunteer navies and such, but there were quite a number of nations that Britain was at war with who were a lot more enthusiastic about the either impressing people into service or just slinging them from prison into service on their ships. So it was... they were kind of holding themselves a little bit above it, but also, as you might guess from the original format of the wording, the idea of the song was also to try and encourage people to sign up in the first place. So you can read it in that case in one of two ways, of either saying, look how great it all is, look, come on, let's all sign up together, let's all go in as freemen, which also means you get better pay, incidentally, rather than the impressment gang coming to get us, and we end up doing the same thing anyway. Or you can read it as a more subtle threat of like, come and work for us freely, or else we'll come and get you, and you'll work for us anyway. So you can read it either way, depending on how charitable you feel towards the Royal Navy of the 18th and 19th centuries. Christopher asks, assuming Camperdown correctly interpreted the intent of Tryon's signal, this is Admiral Tryon, and didn't run him down, how do you see Tryon's influence impacting the Royal Navy in particular during the First World War? So, for those of you unaware, Admiral Tryon was Commander-in-Chief of the British Mediterranean Fleet, which at the time was the Royal Navy's premier command, when he made a series of manoeuvres on exercise, which ultimately ended up with one of his own battleships ramming his flagship and sinking it, which was that was the end of him. Anyway, if he had survived, or assuming Camperdown, as you say, correctly interpreted his signals, I think he could have actually had a significant effect on the First World War, because the whole debacle that led to the sinking and all of his efforts in the lead up to it in various manoeuvres while he was Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet were about simplifying the signals and making it easier for the officers to follow the orders of their commanders in an era when flag signals were the only way of telling each other what was going on. But also he was very much about initiative, getting naval officers to follow their initiative. So rather than strictly follow to the letter of the law what the flag signal had said, assuming of course you'd seen it, and assuming of course not looking at anyone in particular, Seymour, that it was the right signal, instead of just going, oh, that's what the signal says, we're going to do that, he was trying to inculcate a culture where the spirit of the signal, of the orders, would be followed rather than the letter, i.e. you need to show some initiative and actually think about what you're doing and think about how you can best fulfill your orders. Now, for all the strengths of the Royal Navy in the First World War, one of its major weaknesses was that a good number of officers had come up during the late Victorian era when the exact opposite, basically the attitude that Tryon was trying to break, was in effect, which was basically, oh, order say this, and if the order doesn't say this, we don't do it. This actually is one of the great missed opportunities of Jutland, and something that's often pointed out by historians, namely the fact that the German High Seas Fleet cut back through the Royal Navy during the night. But although various Royal Navy units engaged the elements of the High Seas Fleet to varying degrees, and other units spotted the High Seas Fleet, they never actually reported this back to Jellicoe when it would have been useful information, basically because it was like, well, we haven't got orders to do that, and I'm sure my superior will do that, except your superior probably doesn't know what's going on, but never mind. And you also see this in things like 5th Battle Squadron, where BT leaves them with an order to go one direction, and then when BT goes herring off in another direction chasing after the German battle cruisers, it takes a while for Rear Admiral Evan Thomas to go, maybe we should follow him, because they either hadn't seen or hadn't understood BT's order to follow them. And since they didn't think they had orders, they didn't move, even though they were quite clearly going from the wrong direction. So assuming that Tryon survives and, from good grief, joins forces with Jackie Fisher, and they managed to break a decent number of the upcoming Royal Navy officers of this habit of strictly following the letter of the law, this could have significant impacts on quite a number of various major engagements during the First World War, including obviously Jutland being the major one, but even things like Dogger Bank. Basically, by having Royal Navy officers actually comply with the intent of orders rather than the letter of orders, and thinking for themselves when they couldn't necessarily see orders and weird things seem to be happening, it's entirely possible that the Royal Navy would have achieved much, much greater results due to that. So yeah, Admiral Tryon's loss was one of the much less well-known tragedies, I think, for the Royal Navy in the early 20th century. Right, and so now we come on to the Florida-class battleships video, and there are basically two sources for this one: Battleships and Battlecruisers 1905 to 1970 by Siegfried Breyer, and US Battleships and Illustrated Design History by Norman Friedman. So, now you know where the information came from, let's get on with the questions. Ray Giordano asks, I was wondering why, seemingly, every ship that had hull-mounted underwater torpedo tubes never seemed to have used them. I figured there was a good reason for this, but considering how handy torpedoes are in general, what were the problems? Thanks. So the reasons for this are fairly numerous, but let's look at the more important ones. One of them is actually the bearing. Basically, unlike a deck-mounted torpedo tube or torpedo launcher, which obviously can swivel to a fairly great degree, the underwater torpedo tubes tended to either be fixed or have a very limited arc of travel, which meant that lining up a shot was less a case of lining up the torpedo and more a case of lining up the entire ship. Which, given that they were very much a secondary or even tertiary weapon of the kind of ship that would use them, which was generally battleships, the captains were generally a little bit loath to arrange the entire ship's movement in order to fire off a single torpedo. Apart from that, there's also the issue that whilst the idea of ship-mounted underwater torpedo launchers seemed to be a good idea when they were first implemented, the fact was naval gunfire range rapidly escalated beyond and stayed ahead of, for the most part, useful torpedo range. And for the ships that were getting in close enough where torpedoes would be useful, they tend to be smaller ships where top-mounted swivel launchers generally came into play. So a lot of the ships, the bigger, heavier ships were generally risked a lot less in battle. They saw a lot less action, relatively speaking. But two, even when they got into action, the ranges they fought at were generally beyond the ranges of the torpedoes that they actually carried. So the kind of actions where they could even have physically been used would tended to have been only the very kind of close range knockdown drag out fights, which themselves were spectacularly rare. So you're talking about engagements. Well, an engagement like, say, Second Battle of Narvik, where Warspite goes up against the German destroyers, but at that point its main guns are more than sufficient for the job. The fight between between South Dakota and Kirishima, and then Washington and Kirishima, would have been an ideal scenario for the use of torpedoes, but obviously that didn't happen. Then you've got Hood versus Bismarck, where in theory it might have happened. More information on that later. And then you've got obviously Rodney versus Bismarck, where it did happen. One of the rare instances that it did actually occur. So yeah, you can get an idea and a feel for the kind of engagements where this kind of thing was actually attempted. So yeah, lack of use of underwater torpedo tubes, basically a case of very little action by the ships carrying them, relatively speaking, to the rest of their respective navies, and when they did get into action, they tended not to get close enough to actually use them. Josh Thomas Moore asks, of all the Royal Navy warships at the end of World War II, why was HMS Belfast picked to be made a museum ship and not HMS Warspite, etc., or one of the King George V's? Basically, luck and endurance. HMS Belfast lasted in active Royal Navy service until well into the 1960s and was only due for disposal at the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, at a time when Britain had considerably more money, and having become a lot older, it was of much more interest as a museum ship. Even then, it was a very close run thing, with various bureaucrats, despite an active interest in wanting to preserve the ship, still wanting to scrap it. Eventually, it took the intervention of various members of Parliament, up to and including a member of Parliament who had served on Belfast during its battle with Scharnhorst and during the D-Day landings, just to get them to stop scrapping the ship, which they'd already started doing. So yeah, but it was by the skin of its teeth at a period when Britain was much more capable of affording to preserve it, and it had a lot more money to do so. Plus the fact that, make not too many bones about it, as a light cruiser, if you look at where it's positioned on the River Thames, if you're going to put a museum ship there, even with the town class light cruiser, they had to dredge a portion of the Thames to fit it there. Finding somewhere nice and safe to stick something the size of the Warspite would always be a challenge, albeit I think Portsmouth Historic Dockyard would have been greatly enhanced by the Warspite being there, even if it's moored up like the Warrior is. But yeah, unfortunately, most of the Royal Navy ships that you really would have liked to see preserved, like Warspite, Vanguard, etc., they all went to the breakers at a time when Britain flat out just did not have the money. Belfast basically got there by lasting long enough until they did. Corey Bradley asks, what do you think would have happened if Hitler had not sent out Bismarck when he did and had waited for Tirpitz to come online? Do you think they would have had more chances of making it if they'd gone out together? On paper, you'd think yes, but there are two main complicating factors to take into account. One of which is what happens to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Do they still make the Channel Dash or not? If you've got the two battleships ready to sail, Hitler might be tempted to keep the two Scharnhorsts in France and have them sail out to meet them, or alternatively, if the Channel Dash happens anyway, then you've got two damaged Scharnhorst class, and they might then think, well, that we've got them right here. We need to wait even longer until they're fixed. Obviously, Gneisenau probably won't be, but you might get Scharnhorst to come with, which would be nice. Anyway, the other problem, a minor problem, not one of the other big ones, but a minor problem would be Tirpitz coming online when it does historically in the middle of the year is going to make it very much easier to find and track them because extended daylight hours at the northern latitudes. So yeah, there's a very narrow window in the autumn of 1941 where potentially the ships could have had a better chance going out together, maybe with Prince Eugen and any other Admiral Hipper or Deutschland class that they wanted to send out with them. The main problem they'd face is the fact that by that point Victorious and Prince of Wales would have been fully worked up, and it's probably fairly likely that that Hood would have gone into a refit, so the Royal Navy would have pulled in one of its other heavy hitters, maybe Rodney or Nelson, or maybe one of the other King George V's newly commissioning, to bulk up the home fleet, which means that their opposition would be a lot scarier and probably have air support, which would not necessarily be a good thing for them. The reason I say there's a very narrow window in that autumn period is because your next real opportunity is going to be at the beginning of 42, and by that point the Americans are involved in the war, and then you're suddenly talking about more ships generally, but especially additional American warships present, which just make the whole thing a lot more complicated. But yeah, there is a narrow window in which Bismarck and Tirpitz going out theoretically have a better chance, but practically speaking, with the proliferation of radar and more British capital ships coming online, more carriers getting their air groups up to speed, it's more likely that you're sending them out into a really big naval battle rather than actual successful commerce raiding. And finally, for this section, Coyote Hater says, of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa class battleships, which was the best design and how did they compare to the King George V class? Well, each battleship of the ones you mentioned had their own strengths and weaknesses. The North Carolina is the most directly comparable because they were designed at the same time as the King George V's, and were actually designed to have very similar armaments. The North Carolinas were designed with more 14-inch guns. They actually retained the three quads that the King George V's were originally intended for, at the expense of armour, and they were designed for about the same speed. So, but then obviously they were redesigned when the escalator clause came in with the 1616s. So the North Carolinas, compared to the King George V's, very approximately, this is obviously going to be a very quick, roughly speaking, but the North Carolina's advantages were heavier main battery with the 1616s, superior anti-aircraft battery, but they were actually slower, although on paper they were the same speed. The North Carolinas had severe problems getting up to top speed and then not vibrating like an earthquake when they were at those speeds, so King George V's on average were faster ships, and the King George V's were much better protected in terms of armour thickness than the North Carolinas, which were designed for long-range gunfights against 14-inch guns and weren't the world's best protected battleships. So, yeah, the strengths and weaknesses in North Carolina. South Dakota's follow-on design, similar armament, better armour layout, better armour scheme with the inclined armour, although again constrained by the 35,000 ton weight restriction. So they're definitely better than the Royal Carolinas in as much as they can actually make their design top speed, but they are somewhat cramped. And again, so similar to North Carolina's better main battery, much better anti-aircraft battery, although obviously King George V class anti-aircraft battery would improve during the Second World War. We're talking about at time of launch. Armour scheme, again, better than North Carolina's. King George V's armour scheme by thickness and sort of resistance when shells impact the belt at realistic battle ranges, probably still somewhat superior. But South Carolina is closing in on that. And then you get to the Iowas, which are faster, much more heavily armed, both in primary and anti-aircraft weapons. Their only disadvantage, again, being effectively a repeat of the South Dakota's armour scheme. So with the inclined 12-inch belts on South Dakota and Iowa at long range, you could argue that their belts are more effective because of the massive amount of angle that induces on incoming shells. But again, that's designed around long-range gunfire, which tended to not be so much of a feature of battleship engagements. So at the shorter ranges, King George V's thicker slab-sided armour is probably a bit more effective. Although if you're comparing like against like, the fact is at the kind of ranges that most battleship engagements actually occurred, the armour probably isn't going to afford that much protection anyway. At least in a full-on broadside engagement. So King George V basically, and obviously the other thing is King George V's gun mounts start off as pretty unreliable. So in terms of the best design of the three for the US, personally, I have a soft spot for the South Dakota class. The Iowa class are flat out better than the South Dakotas, but given the amount of displacement that went into them, I think the Iowas are probably slightly less efficient as battleships than they could have been otherwise. They sacrificed an awful lot for their speed. So on a pure efficiency basis, the South Dakotas are better, but the South Dakotas were very short, cramped ships, which limited their service life. So it's that balance you have to strike between what's a better ship in terms of overall career lifespan and what's a better ship in terms of pound for pound efficiency as a battle unit. And yeah, so then as they compare, well, in a straight up gunfight, I would, if you're talking about sort of late war, I would probably give a King George V the advantage over the North Carolina purely on the basis of the fact that King George V can probably take a few more hits. South Dakota is probably even odds, more maybe edging towards the South Dakota, based on the shell firepower. And the Iowa class has pretty much all the cards over a King George V. So yeah, hope that helps. Okay, and on to the more general questions from other videos. So Santiago Trujillo Tobon, and shout out to one of my earliest subscribers, asks two questions. Well, I'll go for the second one first, obviously. What was the mechanical condition of the reserve or third fleet at the beginning of World War I? It appears that some ships were literal scrap piles, like the Live Bait Squadron and Canopus, while others were at least combat capable, like Good Hope, Monmouth and Cornwall. Well, I mean, it's somewhat generous to describe Good Hope and Monmouth as combat capable, but well, let's go with that. Anyway, we were talking more about the mechanical conditions anyway. So, yeah, in theory, they should all be combat operational as a reserve fleet. They were supposed to be all maintained and kept in working order. But obviously that maintenance all happens on a cycle, so whichever ships are furthest away from having been fully maintained at the time that they get called up are obviously going to be in worse condition. Generally speaking, most of the ships of the reserve fleet or the third fleet were operational when it came to mechanical issues. The main thing was that a lot of them were running nearly on expired engines and such, so problems would crop up relatively quickly in some of them, and as a result, their overall efficiency and the fact whether or not some of their engines and boilers are even working would deteriorate a lot quicker than operational units of, say, the Grand Fleet. Plus, obviously, being ships used on secondary and tertiary duties, they were further back in the queue when it came to actually getting replacement parts, etc. So yeah, mechanical condition when they came out of the reserve was probably about as good as you could expect, but some of them deteriorated a lot faster than others because of where they were on their mechanical life cycles at the time they were put into reserve. And the first question, I thought I'd separate them out, is talking about the planned attack by the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, against the Salerno landings that was supposed to take place, but was stopped by the armistice the day before. The force being supposed to be the 3 Littorio-class battleships. So Littorio dash, well, it was later renamed Italia, but anyway, Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and Roma. About half a dozen light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Now, obviously, as Santiago says, they're unlikely to win a full frontal fight against basically the entire Mediterranean fleet, an American task force, and the various battleships that have been roped in for bombardment. So he says, do you think they would have gone Operation Tango style, or would they have turned around in the first 5 minutes? And what would be the possible damage to both sides in either case? So I don't think the Italians would have turned tail and run. They knew exactly what they were getting into in terms of the forces that were landing and their escorts. So yeah, and the other thing is as well, the Italian Navy, as I mentioned in another Drydock episode, had finally seemed to have ditched most of the political and, shall we say, not so competent admirals, and actually was led by a fairly decent admiral. And so with the Italian homeland under invasion, I think it's very likely that he would have just pressed straight on and tried to do as much damage as humanly possible. There wasn't really many other choices. It was that, or well, what actually historically happened, which is Italy got invaded, and first duty of the military is to try and stop that. But anyway, in overall terms, the Italian Navy, if they go operational Tango, which to be honest, given their fuel shortages, that probably is their only option, they are, shall we say, horribly outnumbered. There are 59 destroyers and 11 light cruisers in the Allied landing force. So the Italian light cruisers and destroyers are rather badly outgunned, shall we say. That's putting it mildly. Now, in terms of battleships, oh boy, now this, assuming that the cruisers and destroyers go off and batter each other senseless somewhere, this would be quite the fight for the ages. You've got, okay, albeit Littorio-Italia is recovering from bomb damage, but needless to say anyway, you have 3 modern Italian battleships, and the battleship component is Force H. That's Nelson, Rodney, Warspite, Fritz X, and Valiant. So, yeah, 4 older battleships versus 3 newer ones, all with rare, fairly scarily effective weapons. Now that would be a fight I would pay good money to watch. I don't think the Italians would win, and that's not just me being British. It's, in fact, well, one, it's 4 versus 3, so one of those ships is going to get 3 shots in, which is going to be fun. But perhaps more to the point, obviously the British battleship force is slower, but only has to defend. The Italians have to attack. The slightly larger problem for the Italians is that there's 2 fleet carriers and 4 escort carriers present. You've got illustrious and formidable plus 4 escort carriers, so there's going to be a lot of air support, and that's one of the main reasons I don't see the Italians winning, because again, as I say, even if we assume for a moment that we ignore the entirety of the massive Allied destroyer presence, and the light cruisers, which are probably going to waltz through the Italian forces through sheer force of numbers, if nothing else, and then come at them come at the battleships. Even all that aside, you're talking about a fairly consistent and constant pattern of torpedo and bomb strikes against the Italian ships, whilst they are also trying to fight off Nelson, Rodney, Warspite, and Valiant. So it would be absolutely spectacular. There would be a lot of casualties on both sides, but I don't think the landings would be overall that heavily disrupted. But it would give us the largest battleship engagement of World War II if it had happened, so it might be a fun one to consider. Laurie asks, Spanish galleons are often discussed by non-naval people, rightly or wrongly, as being incredibly dangerous ships in naval combat, to the point where I've had a history school teacher tell me they were better than any other naval ships at the time. While I'm aware this is wrong, how wrong would you say it is, and do you think a galleon would have a chance against any ship of the line? Well, to answer the second part first, galleon versus ship of the line? Well, a ship of the line evolved from the evolution of the galleon. So it's like the classic ship of the line is about 2 generations and about 100 years ahead of a galleon. So, galleon versus ship of the line? No, ship of the line is going to run all over that quite happily. As far as galleons being dangerous ships in combat, it depends entirely at the time you're looking at, because remember, galleons are evolutions of other ships. The evolution in basically, you can start out if you want with a cog, the standard Northern European medieval warship, and that evolves into the carrack, and the carrack has significant advantages when it comes to fighting in the Mediterranean. It's not all-powered, so it is a bit more vulnerable to being becalmed, but both carracks and cogs and hulks and other sort of northern and Atlantic coast European warships, when they get into the Mediterranean, they run up against lightly built galleys and such like that are much smaller than them, much less heavily built than them, and once cannons start to come in, carry far fewer cannon than them, and also fewer men. So they kind of roll all over lightweight galleys and other such vessels that are generally found as the Mediterranean's warship of choice, especially in conflicts with the Ottomans. The galleon evolves out of the carrack, and initially as a sort of armed merchantman, but later as a full-on warship. And it kind of takes that development to the ultimate level of having a high forecastle and aftercastle, which contains both cannons and men mounting anti-personnel weapons, and then fighting tops in the masts, and then the main battery, albeit, yes, the main battery is not particularly fast-firing, but there's a fair number of them compared to the kind of people and ships they're fighting at the time. So effectively, you can imagine a galleon in its prime as kind of an ocean-going floating fortress versus the much smaller and lighter ships of, well, practically anybody else, Mediterranean especially, but even in Northern Europe, the galleon is a step above the regular kind of armed merchants and converted carracks and such that are floating around at the time. As you can see in this picture, the size comparison between a Spanish galleon and a Dutch warship, quite the difference there. However, due to the relatively low accuracy and low firing speed of the cannon, they were still very much ships that were designed to get alongside and board as soon as possible. And yes, they remained very dangerous in a boarding action for a considerable amount of time, purely because of their sheer size and therefore number of men that were carried. However, better than any other naval ships of the time. Again, it depends on the time. Initially, when they put out to sea, then yeah, they probably are sort of the jack of all trades, master of none, but supremely large floating fortress of the ocean. You don't want to mess with them. However, people start to come up with counters to them relatively quickly. The classic one, obviously, being the English race-built galleon, which cuts down massively on the superstructure and emphasises much faster firing of naval cannon. Once those kind of ships start to come in, then the galleon's place as top dog in naval combat is very much diminished. Although, as I said, because the race-built galleons tend to be smaller, they are still vulnerable to being boarded if they let the galleons get close enough, as per the Revenge. The first Revenge, the one that Drake captained during the Armada, and which we've done a video on. So, yeah, as far as how wrong it is to say the Galleon is better than any other naval ship of the time, it's not wrong at the beginning of the Galleon's era, but for most of the era that most people are generally aware of Galleons, i.e. what in the UK would be the late Tudor and early Stuart period, they're not the top of the tree, as it were. If you want to look at a sort of multiplayer game classes, you can imagine the Galleon by the mid to late 1500s and going into the 1600s is kind of the tank class of naval warfare, whereas the race-built Galleon is very much the DPS class. Don't ask what the healer class is, I have no flipping idea, and if anyone so much as mentions rogues, there will be pain, lots of pain. Rolf, son of Rolf, asks, does anyone know what the armament of the Erzherzog Ferdinand Max was supposed to be when it was launched before the 1866 war cancelled the order from Krupp? The answer is, according to a fair bit of digging, apparently Krupp breech-loading 8-inch guns. Albeit that some of the period sources say 8¼ inch guns. So take that as you will, but yeah, probably 203 to 210 millimeter breech loading Krupp guns were supposed to be its intended armament. Hopefully that's useful to you. Revan UTC-8 asks, how well did the American standard type battleships, Nevada through to Tennessee, Colorado, compare to the other World War I era super-dreadnoughts, not just in terms of speed, but in terms of things like all-or-nothing armour scheme, and obviously being oil-fired? Well, it's quite the range, isn't it? Nevada through Colorado, but let's have a look anyway. So first things first, what are we comparing it against? Well, the only German super-dreadnoughts, as far as any kind of loose definition of the term goes, were the Bayern and Baden, in terms of, well, at least in terms of ships completed. And in other terms of other nations' ships completed, you've got the Queen Elizabeths and the Revengers, and the various 13.5-inch gun ships of the Royal Navy, the Orions, the King George V's, and the Iron Dukes. Beyond that, well, yeah, you've got the Fusos and the Iseis in the Japanese side of things. So let's take a look. Now, of those, I'm going to take out the British 13.5-inch gunships, and that is purely on the basis that the earliest ship that we're looking at from the US Navy, the Nevada class, only commissioned in March 1916, whereas all of the Royal Navy's 13.5-inch gunships are in commission pretty much before the start of the First World War. And 2 and a bit years is actually a fairly long time in terms of battleship development in this time period. So we're only going to look at the larger ships, 14-inch and 15-inch gun super dreadnoughts. Now, one thing that across the board stands out with US super dreadnoughts is that they are slower than all their contemporaries. The Revenge class, once they're actually built with Jackie Fisher's intervention with oil firing, were about 2 knots faster. Fusos and Iseis likewise 2 knots faster. Queen Elizabeth 3 to 4 knots faster on a good day with a following wind. Even Bayern and Baden were at least a knot faster, and that's than most of them. The Nevada class were a knot slower than the standard line normally, and so yeah, propulsion-wise, pretty much every other super dreadnought was slightly quicker. You've also got in the propulsion department the Oklahomas, the last dreadnought built by any serious naval power with vertical triple expansion engines. And on the slightly more innovative side, one of the New Mexicos and the Tennessees are using the turbo-electric drive, as well as the Colorado's using that as well. So that's a slightly different drive system to the standard straightforward steam turbines, although they're still using steam turbines to generate the power. So in the traditional battleship triangle, we've covered speed. Now, what about firepower and protection? So protection-wise, it's almost the other way around. The American battleships are amongst the most heavily protected. From the Nevada class onwards, they go with an armor belt of maximum 13.5 inches thick, and of course they are all using the all or nothing armor scheme from Nevada onwards. So that's the main belt, and commensurately the rest of the armor protection is similar. Now compare that to their competitors. The Fusos and Iseis are 1.5 inches thinner on the belt at 12 inches maximum. The Bayerns, fractionally thicker at the maximum at 13.8. And the Queen Elizabeths are around about the same level of protection, 13-inch maximum belt thickness. Then you've got the Revenge class, which are similar but with a wider 13-inch strake. Now, pure armor thickness doesn't tell the entire story because, of course, the Queen Elizabeths, the Bayerns, and the Fusos, and the Revengers, and the Iseis are all using the distributed armor scheme. So, although the Fusos are kind of at the tail end of things there, I would say that the US battleships are generally the better protected, thanks to that 13.5-inch thick armor belt compared to everybody else. So protection, big tick there, even if they're a little bit slow. Now, firepower is interesting because the Nevadas go in with 10 14-inch guns, everybody else up to the Colorados uses 12. Colorados, of course, using 8 16-inch guns. Now, we compare that with everyone else. The Fusos and the Iseis match the 12 14-inch guns of the Americans, but they go with 6 twin turrets, whereas outside of the Nevadas, everybody else in the US battle line goes for 4 triples instead of the 6 twins. Now, Bayern, Baden, Queen Elizabeth, Revenge, they all are carrying 8 guns, so significantly fewer, but they are carrying 15-inch weapons. Now, in the World War I period, specifically, and immediately thereafter, the firepower is also affected by a couple of other factors. Initially, obviously, sort of up to the Battle of Jutland, immediately thereafter, the British shells are not as effective as they should be. They have a tendency of just blowing up as soon as they hit something, but they do get replaced later on by Green Boy shells and become dramatically more effective. Bayern shells are pretty decent, a little bit on the lightweight side, and Fuso shells, they're alright, they're 14-inch shells and nothing spectacular, but nothing particularly negative either. However, and this is a big one, the American 14-inch guns, quite a few of them suffer from quite significant accuracy and dispersion issues, which are either not fully solved or not solved at all until well into the interwar period. That, despite them generally carrying more barrels, does put them at a disadvantage against ships that have fairly punchy guns with good accuracy, particularly the Queen Elizabeths and the Revengers with the 15-inch 42s once they have the Green Boy shells, because 12 barrels that can't hit the broadside of a barn versus 8 barrels firing slightly heavier shells with a lot bigger explosive charges in them that will actually come crashing down on top of your head, I'm going to bet on the latter. Now, obviously, that's a very crude estimation. I mean, the American 14-inch guns, they do vary, and of course, with Colorados, they've got the 16-inch guns, which does put their firepower well ahead of everybody else we just listed. So, where do they sit? Well, the other thing is, size-wise, the standards are going up a little bit. You've got the difference between the Nevadas and the Colorados is about 5,000 tons, which is a significant amount in World War I battleship overall weights. And of course, there's general improvements in underwater protection and other matters as the various classes are developed. So, this is very much obviously a broad brush approach, but overall, yeah, that's kind of where they stack up with everybody. I would say if you're going to take the sort of the more limited numbers of super dreadnoughts in the other navies that are comparative for time, so as we said, Bayern, Baden, Fuso and Issei classes and Queen Elizabeth and Revenge classes. If you were going to put me into a corner, I'd say on average the Nevadas and the Pennsylvanias, probably on average slightly below the average that's set by the other ships. Probably the Pennsylvanias are about equal to the Fusos. The 15-inch ships of Britain and Germany I would put above them. The New Mexicos and the Tennessees, this is where I'd tend to put them on an equal footing, assuming that everybody solved their various shell and gun accuracy issues. And then the Colorados obviously are stand head and shoulders above everybody else, as basically their only downside is they're slightly slower than everybody else. They have superior firepower, they have very good protection, and to be honest, that's to be expected given that they're about 2 to 3 years younger than everything else under consideration. So yeah, hopefully that, well, long for a dry dock, short for an overall answer, covers some of what you ask. Hope for the Best asks, what kind of changes had to be made in the design and construction of aircraft carriers as the jet age dawned? Well, there were a lot of changes that were made. The question about changes that had to be made is a slightly more subtle one. Changes that were made included the widespread introduction of effective catapults, which had been a little bit hit or miss across various navies beforehand. The angled flight deck was obviously another. Then you also had the mirror landing system, and all sorts of general improvements. However, changes for design and construction that had to be made, well, the angled flight deck was probably one of them, to be fair, considering the size and weight and landing speed of newer aircraft. You just needed a lot more deck space for them. But that leads into the other things. So the decks themselves needed to be a lot stronger. With obviously with propeller-driven aircraft, you just had to contend with what was effectively high-velocity wind and a little bit of exhaust fumes. With jet aircraft, you had a long, very hot plume of jet exhaust. So having highly flammable materials such as wood on your flight deck, maybe not so much of a good idea anymore. You also had to have jet blast deflectors for that reason, so you had to reinforce the decks to cope with the heat. You also had to reinforce the decks to cope with the weight, because jet aircraft tended to weigh a lot more than their contemporaries from a few years prior. Now, along with additional weight comes additional size, and this was actually one of the primary reasons you see most of the British armoured carriers disappearing off the front lines and into training roles relatively quickly after the Second World War. Not the rather stupid meme that goes around about them being structurally damaged by kamikazes warping frames. That is complete and utter nonsense. I see it prop up far too often from basically a single article that can't provide any sources and gets a lot of its facts provably wrong. Anyway, little rant aside, now the main reason that the British carriers, armoured carriers of the Second World War, appear to have basically been shuffled off to training roles for about 10 to 15 years before being retired was almost entirely down to this increase in size from jet aircraft, because they, due to their armoured decks, had been built with relatively low ceilings in their hangar decks. American carriers had not. American carriers had substantially higher ceilings than most of the British carriers that had been built pre and during the war. And with these new, larger aircraft, modern aircraft just couldn't fit. Simple as. So yeah, aircraft carriers like the Essex class that had very roomy, generous hangars could fit the newer aircraft, and the new build carriers obviously had to be designed with these newer, taller aircraft in mind, and that's why if you've ever been on any of the carriers, well, let's face it, museum carriers, if you've been in America and you've been on a museum carrier, you will notice that the hangar decks are very, very high, and that's because, well, yeah, look at a jet aircraft, and now look how high that tail fin is. You don't want to lose your tail fin. And you need plenty of space above the aircraft to work, so it's not just a case of how tall is the tail fin, it's how tall is the tail fin plus the clearance you need to work on it and manoeuvre it around safely. So yeah, most of the changes had to do with the effects of the jet engine itself on the flight deck, and then the size and shape and weight of the aircraft needing larger and larger and carriers with taller and taller flight decks. Outside of that, well, you had jet fuel, although whether jet fuel is more volatile than aviation gasoline is neither here nor there. It generally depends on what exact mixture you're using. So yeah, in terms of changes that had to be made, I'd say that's probably it. Obviously, you need more powerful steam catapults because you have more heavy aircraft. You need to get them up to a higher speed, and similarly strengthen your crash deck landing systems. Kevin asks, how much of an impact did the capture of the SS Automedon have on the early stages of the Pacific theatre? So, for those of you who are unaware, SS Automedon was a cargo ship that was, with a few passengers, that was carrying supplies to Singapore. It was captured by the German merchant raider Atlantis in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but its cargo of mixed food, spare parts, vehicles, etc., was not the important thing. What was the important thing was a particular bag, amongst a few other bags of classified mail, but this particular bag contained basically the keys to the kingdom of the British Empire in the Far East. It contained details of defences, force concentrations, actions of what to do in the event of a war with Japan, what role Australia and New Zealand would play, how they'd operate with the Dutch, where forces would be deployed and to what strength, etc. But most critically, and bear in mind this is in mid-1940, most critically, it detailed exactly what the British response to escalating hostilities and eventual possible war with Japan would be, and it wasn't good. The plan was effectively to abandon significant portions of their holdings, although hope that they would hold out for a fair amount of time, in the attempt to just hold up at places like Singapore, India, Burma, that kind of area, but effectively to write off almost everything further east of that. Further, the British were not planning on sending any kind of significant naval reinforcements into the area unless they were able to completely crush the Italian fleet in the Mediterranean, which obviously didn't look very likely. So it gave the Japanese a huge boost because it meant that although they were on a collision course with America, they had actually been genuinely worried about what the British could do. They'd had an alliance with the British earlier in the century. They still looked up to the British as the largest colonial power, and they knew the power and might of the British Navy, and they were, to a certain extent, rightfully worried about what would happen if they ended up going to war with America and Britain jumped in with both feet, since the Japanese, for all the fact they had an alliance with the Germans, didn't rate either the Italian or German navies particularly highly compared to their own or either of the British or Americans. So, with all that said, why was this important? Well, basically it said the Japanese were worried, and this document basically said, don't worry. The British had done a very good job up to that point of pretending to be quite strong in the Far East, but this blew it wide open and gave the Japanese confidence that, say, for example, they could take most of their combined fleet and sail over to a particular harbour in Hawaii and try and bomb and torpedo everything in sight, because they knew that the British wouldn't immediately launch a mass naval counter-offensive into their own holdings in the Far East. And that probably influenced a great deal Japanese policy as to how to deal with the Pearl Harbor attacks and the subsequent campaigns thereafter. One can only imagine if that document, when they'd opened it, had said, well, if Japan declares war, we will immediately dispatch a very powerful fleet to contest them, and then the Japanese, knowing that, when they'd launched their attack, preparing to launch their attack on Pearl Harbor, had been forced to leave significant portions of the combined fleet behind just in case. And so then the attack on Pearl Harbor is nowhere near as effective. Not so many ships are sunk, not so many lives are lost. The Americans are still going to be mightily ticked off, I rather imagine, but they're going to have substantially more of their ships and men still intact, and therefore can begin offensive operations earlier against a Japan whose own naval forces are going to be divided in fear of a massive fleet flying the white ensign showing up over the western horizon. That could have been a very different Pacific War, and it all rotated around the capture of one little merchant ship. And finally for this week, Iron Physic asks, would it be a smarter idea for any nation in World War II to build more submarines than battleships historically? Well, let's review, shall we? I mean, the Japanese didn't get the world's tremendous amount of use out of their battleships, really. But at the same time, did they really get much effective use out of their submarines? Not really. Don't think either way it would have helped the Japanese all that much. The Americans, well, they had a bit of an embarrassment of riches when it came to their battleships, but at the same time, well, it's World War World War Two America, sorry, they did have quite a few submarines as well. And to be honest, the submarines that they had, at least for a good part of the war, it wasn't so much the numbers of submarines, it was whether or not you could persuade Bureau of Ordnance to fix the Mark 14 torpedo. So I don't think cancelling a battleship or two for the US Navy would have helped all that much. I mean, there's only so many times you can kill the entire Japanese merchant marine. Then let's see, we've got the Italians. The Italians might well have benefited, to be honest. I mean, Roma managed to, well, it managed to get built, do a little bit, then get blown up by Fritz X, and Impero was never finished. So perhaps the resources devoted to those two being put into more submarines might have made the Italian fleet a bit more effective in the Mediterranean. The British, well, they stopped building the Lion class. They did need the King George V's. Their submarine got up to a fair bit, but they really only built the Vanguard during the war. To be honest, actually with the British, I'd almost actually argue they might have been better off building fewer submarines and building the Lion and Temeraire instead of Vanguard. But that's just me. The Germans, definitely, I think. The Bismarck and Tirpitz, for all that they were nice and big and shiny, were ultimately wastes of resources at the time they were being built. And if they had devoted that much resource into actually building more U-boats, the U-boats, when they had their biggest opportunities early in the war, might have scored a lot more victories. Although, again, personally, I think a more balanced approach would have been to build more Scharnhorst class with the 15-inch guns rather than the Bismarcks, as well as more U-boats. So, yeah, I think that would be my evaluation of the major combatants of the World War II period. And so with that, we wrap up this episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon in another video. Thank you very much.